Hey guys, welcome to Telling the Told and Untold. My name is Tshego. Showmax recently released a new crime documentary and it's titled Devilsdorp. Devilsdorp took place in Krugersdorp and it follows a series of brutal murders that took place between 2012 and 2016. This case is so crazy, for lack of a better word. There's so much that happens and there's so many twists and turns. A journalist that appears in the documentary says that if she wasn't there throughout the whole trial, she wouldn't have believed it happened, and I think that's the only way to describe it because it's insane. As I mentioned earlier, this case took place in Krugersdorp, and Krugersdorp is a town within the West Rand. It's in an area on the western side of Johannesburg, South Africa. It was a mining town and President Paul Kruger once lived there. It was funded when the gold rush started, and many people moved from all the places they lived in to Krugersdorp to hopefully dig for gold, find it, and just have a well-off life. On the 10th of May 2016, Anthony Schofield's body was found in the boot of an abandoned car outside a primary school. He was found in a black plastic bag. He was a financial advisor and they could tell that he had been strangled. After he was murdered, 16,000 Rand was taken out of his account. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 26th of May, Kevin McAlpine's body was found. He was a financial advisor and he had an appointment for 6 p.m., the same as Anthony Schofield. And once he didn't get home at a certain time, his wife said that she called the car tracking company to try and find him because she thought maybe something had happened and maybe he was on the side of the road looking for help and was just hurt. And after 15 minutes, she got a call that the car had been found. They opened the boot and they found Kevin's body. He too was in a black plastic bag and appeared to be strangled. Whilst his wife was on the phone with the people that had found the car, they asked for a picture of her husband, and she said that as soon as they got the picture, she was still on the phone with them and she heard the guy whisper, "It's him." And no one really wanted to tell her that her husband had been found murdered because at the time she was 7 months pregnant. And when they did eventually tell her, they made sure that there was an ambulance nearby just in case something happened to her or her husband. After Anthony was murdered, 1,300 Rand was also withdrawn from his account. And after Kevin's body was found, the whole of Krugersdorp was scared because now there were 2 guys that had been murdered. They were financial advisors and they just went for a normal appointment in the evening and then they turned up dead in the boot of their cars. And after this, people didn't want to go for any appointments. Financial advisors wouldn't see clients and just a lot was going on. Then less than a week later, on the 30th of May, Hanli Latakhan, a real estate agent, didn't go home. Everyone thought that she was missing, especially her son, because she didn't get home when she usually did. So he decided to call his father and tell him that Hanli didn't come home, and he knew his wife's appointments, what time she had them, she had like a normal schedule. And at the time, people really didn't think much of it. They thought that maybe she had been caught up by something or had been stuck in traffic. And that was everyone's thought until Hanli's husband got a notification that someone had tried to withdraw money from his account. After this, Hanli's son and his wife got into his car and they started driving around Krugersdorp trying to find his mother's car and his mother. And that's when they received a phone call that Hanli's car was found outside the Krugersdorp hospital. They got to the hospital and Hanli's car was there and it was parked. So they started searching the car from the front seat to the back seat, and then everyone's heart started beating as they opened the boot and Hanli wasn't there. Then they opened a missing persons a missing persons report, and at the time that this happened, everyone was just saying to themselves that these people that killed Kevin and Anthony had struck again, and Hanley was the third victim, and everyone was just so scared. And at around 11 p.m. that night, they had to call off the search because it was getting late and they couldn't see. They did, however, manage to get CCTV footage from the hospital that was pointing towards the parking lot, and they saw Hanley drive in. She parked her car, got out, and met a white woman who seemed to have black hair. They started walking, turned the corner, and that was the last actual footage of Hanley alive. Unfortunately, the next day she was found in a veld. She too was in a black plastic bag and was found by kids walking past on their way to school. After Hanley's body was found, everyone just became even more scared than they already were, because now it wasn't just financial advisors going missing, it was real estate agents too, anyone that had appointments set. And after this, the media dubbed the set of murders the appointment murders, and this just started a string of investigations. Police officers decided to go to the ATMs where the money had been withdrawn and tried to have been withdrawn from Hanley's husband's card. And obviously we all know that ATMs have like camera footage, so they got informers to just look through the footage and try to see what they can find. And that's when they saw two young people's faces that had been there on 3 occasions, and that was when Kevin was murdered, when Anthony was murdered, and when Hanley was murdered. So it's like the same faces, 3 different crimes. So they just kind of linked those two together, and they got people to just kind of look at the faces and see if they could identify them. And people said that those 2 kids looked like the Steyn siblings. So the Steyn siblings were LaRue Steyn and Marcel Steyn. LaRue Steyn was about 20 years old at the time, and he just worked odd jobs here and there. And Marcel, on the other hand, had just finished high school and had gotten 6 distinctions. So they called them in and they tried to just link them to the pictures that they got from the ATM. So by doing this, they kind of just looked for any identifying features that they could see, put them in beanies, and after this they were identified as the same people from the ATM pictures. And police officers said this was a huge break for them, but they kind of took them in because of money being withdrawn from ATMs and not necessarily linking them to the murders. Then they started interviewing them, and apparently LaRue was very cooperative with the police officers. However, Marcel was very rude, hostile, distant, seemed emotionless, and she was just harder to get through and have conversation with. After asking Marcel where they got the ATM cards and things like that, Marcel says that her and her brother had gotten them from Nigerian men, and she doesn't know if they murdered the 3 people from the appointment murders, but she thinks they did. They had nothing to do with it. On the other hand, LaRue confessed to the murders. LaRue said that he's the one that committed all the murders. He did them on his own. No one helped him. And police officers thought that he was lying just because he was a 20-year-old man. He was skinny, he was scrawny, and to them, they didn't believe that he was capable of carrying their bodies because they were heavy, like dumping their bodies all on his own. And they just kept asking him and pressing him, asking him like, who helped you? You couldn't have done this on your own. So now we're going to go back in time to 2012. In 2012, there were a string of murders. There were 4 murders that happened that year, and they were all said to be linked to occult murders. And after this, the media dubbed them the satanic murders. On the 26th of July 2012, the bodies of Joy Bussmann and Natasha Berger were found. They had both been brutally murdered, and there was so much blood on the scene. And because police officers found books that they thought were linked to Satanism, they just ruled them as occult murders. 3 weeks later, the body of a pastor was found. His name was Rich Bendix, and he had been stabbed to death, and he was found by his wife just on their grass outside their home. In 2012, Michaela Valentine was 25 years old, and her mother described her as someone who was spontaneous, had an easygoing personality, and was basically just a party waiting to happen. One day, Michaela told her mom that she had a calling, and after this, she went to Bible school. She made a lot of friends, she did really well, and everything just seemed to be going really well for her. Because she came from a praying home, her parents started praying that she would meet a really good man that would become her husband. And they say that after this, Michaela would come home with different men, just to introduce them to her parents. And her mom said that she would pray and say, God, if this is not the guy for my daughter, please just open her eyes so she would see this. And on many occasions she would call her mom and say, you know what, mom, it didn't work out with this guy because he's just not for me. And her mom would be happy because she was she could tell, and she's so happy Michaela's eyes were opened. And then one day Michaela came home with a man, and this man's name was Zach Valentine. And her mom says that Zach was a really amazing guy, and she loved him not just as her son-in-law but as her son. And they eventually got engaged, and just a couple of weeks or months before they eventually did get married, Michaela's mom said that she could see that Michaela was becoming even a better person with Zach, and that just made them love him even more. Then on the 4th of October, Zach came home from work and found the body of his wife in bed. She had been stabbed over 60 times in her upper body, and they say that the scene was so bloody. There was literally blood from the ceiling to the walls to the floors. There was just so much blood. And apparently at the time they were trying to sell their house, so when Zach got home, a real estate agent was there as well, and he walked into the room, started screaming and saying, look at my wife, she's been killed. But the reason why her murder was thought to be part of something satanic is because police officers said that once they got to the home, they saw very odd things. And one of the things that stood out for them was that on the wall there was a handwritten Bible verse, and it was so big, you couldn't miss it. And just small things like that. And after that, it was also just ruled maybe a robbery gone wrong, and it was just left at that. Michaela and Zach would go to different training courses that were run by a woman, and her name was Ria Greineveld. Ria started a church in 2006, and it was titled Overcomers Through Christ. And she would go to different places like churches and schools and just preach the word of the Lord. And some people would go up to her and just tell them the stuff that they had been through in their lives. And after this, Ria decided that she wanted to help them even more than she did, so decided to go for training courses in counseling, specifically to deal with people that had gone through satanic ritual abuse. And she got training just to help people. And one day she received a phone call that there was a woman who had escaped from a satanic church, and they just needed her to help her. After this, Ria started changing entirely, and people just couldn't understand why. They'd call her and ask what's going on, what's the story with this woman, and she would explain that this woman is a 42nd-year-old a 42nd generational witch, and she was one of the oldest witches in the country. And people were just very confused because for them, Ria had went to training to deal with people like this, deal with different stories, and now it seemed as though she forgot all about her training and this is what she was focused on. There was one day where a guy called her and asked Ria, what's going on? And she was paranoid. She said that this woman couldn't leave her residence, she couldn't go out of a 30-kilometer radius from her home, or else there'd be death curses set on her. And everyone was just really worried about Rhea. Rhea started leaving her friends, her family, just the life she had, and started focusing only on this woman. And when they asked what this woman's name was, she said Cecilia Steyn. Cecilia Steyn claimed to be, like I said, a 42nd generational witch. She's also said that she had 1,000 personalities. She was a werewolf and had different blood types. And people often said that Cecilia just had something about her, like in her personality, where if she gave you attention, you just wanted to be there for her. And you just felt really special and all those things. And after Rhea and Cecilia started this relationship they had, Rhea started a training course where she would basically just teach people about Satanism, the Satanic Church, so that people would just understand it better. And she had two main courses. One was titled Knowing Your Savior, and the other one was titled Knowing Your Enemy. There were a lot of other people that would go to these training courses, including Michaela and Zach, and a woman. Her name was Miranda Steyn. She is not related to Cecilia Steyn in any way. They just share a surname. And she would go there with her two young children, Marcel Steyn and LaRue Steyn. And she apparently had a really deep connection with Cecilia's testimony, because obviously it was Cecilia's testimony that was used in Rhea's courses about Satanism and the satanic realm. And she just had a really deep connection with her, and over time just became a devout follower of Cecilia Steyn. So from these training courses that Rhea had, they did eventually start a group. And there was Cecilia, Rhea, obviously, a woman, her name was Candace, and she does appear in the documentary, so you can also hear like first-hand accounts of what she experienced. Zach and Michaela, as well as Miranda and her two children, LaRue and Marcel. So Cecilia claimed that she couldn't be left alone for more than like 5 minutes, because if she was left alone, she'd be tempted to go back to the Satanic Church. So people would constantly supervise her, especially Rhea, like to the point where Rhea, like as I mentioned earlier, left her friends, her family. She even moved to an apartment complex on the same street that Cecilia lived on, just so that she could constantly make sure that Cecilia was okay. Cecilia claims that there's also a satanic calendar, and this satanic calendar has different dates, and they're titled High Nights. And what happens on High Nights is that the people from the Satanic Church that she managed to escape from would have rituals like human sacrifices that they would do to try and get back at Cecilia. So what would happen on these nights is that they'd all go to an apartment, they'd have like praise and worship and just things like that. They would sing, and Cecilia would just sit there, and she says that her physical body would be there, but spiritually she wasn't there. And all of a sudden something would happen to her spiritually, and she like would fall on the floor. There'd be blood coming out of her mouth, basically like an exorcism. And these people would pray for her, like call on God to help her. And it's so insane. The documentary literally has footage from this night. It's literally the craziest thing you could ever see. And I think you should also remember that these people are literally doing all of this for God, for Jesus. They believe that they're doing something really good in their Christian faith, and they're helping this woman who escaped a satanic church. And because they have this undying faith and belief in her and in God, they would obviously do anything to try and save her so that she could ultimately end up in heaven where she belongs. I hope that makes sense. Eventually, Candace did leave the group because she started seeing through Cecilia's lies and just didn't want to be a part of that. And around the same time, Ria started distancing herself from the group. And Cecilia did not like this at all, because obviously for her, Ria is the person that brought all these people into Cecilia's life. And she started coming up with even crazier stories about her mother being in like the other spiritual realm, and how she doesn't have a mother anymore, just all these crazy stories. But Ria just eventually cut off contact with Cecilia, and this just, Cecilia hated this. She hated it. And then she started turning everyone she knew basically against Ria, because what else could she do? And after Ria left the group, they decided to call their little group Electus Perdius, and everyone got a tattoo of this name somewhere on their body. And then this group that first started out as like helping this woman who came out of a satanic church started turning into a cult. They had their group leader, who was Cecilia. They had a group name, and after this, everything just started falling apart. On the 27th of November 2015, the bodies of Peter and Johan Meyer were found murdered in their home. They were found by their son Nicholas and his girlfriend, who had just went home to go visit his parents. They then started investigating this murder, and they saw that Miranda Steyn had an appointment with the couple. Miranda wasn't seen as a suspect because they looked into her, and she was a high school teacher. She had no criminal record. So for them, it's just seeing what kind of information she might have. But then they saw that her children, Marcel and LaRue, had been taken into custody for the appointment murders. So after this, they started looking at her a bit differently and decided to go search both her home and her classroom from the high school she worked in. So they went to her home, they searched her home, they couldn't find anything. Then they went to the school she worked at and decided to go search her classroom. So there were two people there. They searched the classroom and they couldn't find anything really. And then one of them was like, no, there has to be something. There's no way, there's nothing. Let's try again. So this guy says they go searching the class again, and that's when he notices that there's two stoves in her classroom. And for him, it was a bit weird, it was a bit odd, because it's not like a hospitality class, food technology class. It's like a normal classroom, so why does she have stoves? So he went to them, and then he opened the oven, and that's where they found so much ammunition. And after this happened, the headmaster finally decided to cooperate and said that she had a will that Miranda had written. So they're like, what will? So she gives them the will, and they read through it, and basically Miranda had disowned her children and said that if anything were to happen to her, all like everything should be given to Cecilia Steyn. And they were like, so after they got this letter, they went back to the prison where LaRue was and asked him, like, do you know whose handwriting this is? He's like, you asked my mother's. So they give him the letter so that he could read through it. And after this, you could visibly see that he was so upset and shaken, like his lips were quivering. And rightfully so, like your mother literally disowned you for some woman. And after this, he was like, you know what? I'm not going down alone. And that's when he finally decided to tell them the whole truth. LaRue then told the police officers everything that had happened, and this is when the link between the 2012 murders and the 2016 murders were finally made. And LaRue told them about Cecilia Steyn, Electus Perdius, everything that had happened, and explained why the murders in 2012 happened, and was basically to get back at Ria for leaving the group because she was so upset. So she went after Natasha Berger, who was literally her right man, who helped her, was always by her side, and Joy was literally just collateral damage. And then the pastor was one of Ria's really closest friends, was her mentor. And Michaela was part of the group, and then she started having some doubts and just didn't want to be a part of it, and this is when they decided that she had to go. And this was so crazy to police officers because they couldn't believe it, and all the murders that happened in 2016 were basically just Cecilia being greedy and just wanting more. On the 16th of December 2015, Michaela's mom got a phone call from Zach's mom that he had been involved in a car accident and didn't make it. About 2 weeks after this happened, Discovery got a phone call from someone wanting to claim Zach's life insurance. And the woman that had called in was Cecilia Steyn and LaRue Steyn. And for them, this was a bit odd because it was an early life claim of 3.6 million rand. That's a lot of money. And number one, Zach's accident didn't seem like your normal accident. It was seemed like the car didn't even like slide off to the side of the road. It was completely burnt. The body in the car couldn't properly be identified because it was so burnt. The second thing is that this claim was made 3 months before he died, which is also a bit odd. So if you go claim the insurance money, but it was only made like 3 months before, it raises eyebrows. And the third thing is before Zach died, money was deposited for this claim. So everything was just suspicious, and they never gave out the claim, but they did go interview Cecilia because she kept like saying that she wanted the money. And apparently when they do all these interviews, they do record it for their own purposes. And as this interview process was going on, Cecilia kept talking about herself, and she didn't even know basic things like where Zach lived and things like that. And that's why they thought it was very suspicious as well. And the documentary does have actual footage of this whole interview process with Cecilia, which is so crazy to watch, to just see how she acts and everything. It did turn out that Zach faked his own death because he was on the brink of getting arrested for the Mayor murders, because he was a part of it as well as Miranda, which is why he decided to basically fake his own death and go into hiding. Eventually this case did go to trial, and LaRue Steyn did plead guilty, and because of this he was sentenced to 25 years. Another man who was part of the group, his name was John Bernard, he also pleaded guilty and he was sentenced to 20 years. After a while, Miranda Steyn did plead guilty as well, but because she was so involved, she was heavily involved in the murders, she was sentenced to 11 life sentences and 115 years. Marcel Steyn, Cecilia Steyn, and Zach Valentine were all found guilty. Marcel was sentenced to 7 life sentences and 144 years. Zach Valentine was sentenced to 8 life sentences and 93 years. And Cecilia Steyn was sentenced to 13 life sentences and an additional 155 years. And that's it for today's case. There are so many details that happen and so many little twists and turns that literally happen throughout this case. So I do suggest you guys go watch Devilsdorp so you guys can go get all those little details that I missed out. It is available to binge watch on Showmax right now. There's literally interviews from people that were directly involved in this case. There's footage from the trial. There's footage of Cecilia's interviews, the exorcism, Michaela speaking, and it's one of the craziest cases I've ever watched or covered. So I do suggest you guys go check that out, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!